Hello guys, welcome to part 2 of Notes on the Categories. And we're going to start with an important recap from part 1. So, genus means a broad category that groups together related species. It answers the question, what is it? And if it is removed, then the species within it would cease to exist. For example, animal is the genus of dog and cat, and also human, right? And species is just a subgroup within a genus, which is more specific, by the way. And it's defined by a unique trait that sets it apart from other species, or in other words, it's differentiate. It still belongs to the genus, but is more specific, as I've said. For example, dog is a species under the genus animal, and also human, by the way. Difference or differentiate is the trait that distinguishes one species from others in the same genus. For example, rationality separates humans from other animals like dog, because humans are rational animals. And property is a characteristic that always belongs to a species but does not define its essence. It is unique to that species. For example, laughter belongs only to humans but is not what makes them human, right? It's not essential to them, basically. An accident is a trait that may or may not belong to a thing without changing its essence. Some accidents can be removed without affecting the subject, while others cannot. For example, having blue eyes is an accident. Changing eye color doesn't change the person's essence, though. And in the categories, Aristotle explained that every word belongs to one of the highest categories, called the supreme genus, and that no matter what, every term can be reduced to one of the categories. There is no exception to this, meaning that even if you were to speak in another language like Spanish or Latin, the words in Latin or Spanish are still gonna, or the terms are still gonna be reduced to one of the 10 categories. And a term is a word that represents a concept, and a concept is an abstraction of an essence. For example, when a child sees a dog for the first time, they mentally separate what is essential, which is dogness or the essence of a dog, from what is accidental, which is its color and size or body. And this allows them to recognize other dogs. Dog represents the essence of caninity, just as animal represents animality. So a word is meant to represent reality. So moving on, we're going to talk about one of the most important categories in Aristotle's philosophy, which is quantities. And this is going to be important because this is how he's going to refute Zeno of Elea on the error paradox, which we'll get into in a bit. And so Aristotle divides quantities into two types, which is discrete quantities, which are composed of separate non-continuous parts, and by non-continuous, Aristotle just means separable and distinct from each other. Continuous quantities is composed of parts that share a common boundary and form a whole. And examples of discrete quantities would be numbers and speech. Parts of numbers are always separate and they don't join at a common boundary. Like number 10, two fives make up 10 but are really distinct and not physically connected to each other. And note that numbers by nature do not have shared boundaries among their parts. Speech is also a measurable quantity because we can measure how long and short syllables are. Syllables in speech are distinct from each other because they don't share a boundary. And so examples of continuous quantities are lines, planes, solids, time, and space. Line is an example because its parts, which are the points, meet a shared boundary, which makes them a line. And planes have boundaries, which are lines, obviously. And solids also have boundaries that are either lines or planes. And so time is continuous. So remember, Aristotle believes time is eternal and didn't just randomly come out of existence, right? There's no such thing as a beginning to time. Time is an unbroken sequence, and Aristotle is also a temporal holist, so he believes that time is continuous and that the unity of time is prior to its parts. The intervals of time, like the divisibility of time. So when Aristotle believes in continuous time, because when Zeno of Elea presented his paradox, Zeno made the assumption that time was a discrete quantity, that time has parts that were separable and really distinct from each other. Now, the problem is that if we were to say that parts of time were really distinct and separable from each other, then no causal relationship could ever flow from those, which would make change impossible. And as if we've seen in the metaphysics, Aristotle refutes claims like that, oh, change is impossible, or that, oh, everything is in flux. And Aristotle would show this would lead to a contradiction. We will get more into this in another video. In the meantime, that is a short answer to how Aristotle uses this distinction. And he believes time is continuous, meaning the intervals of time will eventually overlap, and which allows for the possibility of change, right? Because the parts of time are inseparable and are not much distinct because they have a relation to each other, that's what allows for the possibility of change. So he's a holistic, right? Or he partakes in temporal holism. Okay, and space is also continuous because the parts of a solid has to occupy space and share boundaries with another, because by definition a solid has extension. Sorry if I'm talking slow, but my jaw really hurts today, so. Now, some quantities will have parts that have a relative position to one another. For example, lines, planes, solids, and space. And relative position just really means that they have their position in reference to another. This is because each part has a definable position, and its relationship to adjacent parts can be specified. For example, a part of a line has a specific location on the line, and the parts of a plane can be described in relation to one another. And then some quantities do not have parts that have relative positions to each other, like numbers, time, and speech. Numbers don't have occupied space, so they can't have relative positions. Time doesn't have a fixed position as well, like present, and future. Time doesn't persist in this manner. It is impossible for speech to occupy space because the parts, which are syllables, do not continue to persist after being spoken. But however, quantities that include time, number, and speech have relative order, not relative position, which just means that they have their order in reference to something else. For example, time has events occur in a sequence, which is past before present and present before future. Number, because the sequence is fixed, 1 precedes 2, which precedes 3. Speech, because syllables follow each other in a temporal sequence. Now, moving on to true quantities, the things we have named can only be considered true quantities, which were lines, planes, solids, numbers, time, space, speech. Some things are considered quantitative only in a secondary sense because they derive their quantitative nature from true quantities. Examples like this are a white object. This is measured by their extension or surface area they cover. Actions and processes count because they are measured by their time span. These are not essentially or intrinsically quantitative, they're only called secondary, right? Now, just like substance, quantities do not have contraries, right? True quantities like 2 cubits long or 3 cubits long have no contraries because contraries imply a direct opposition. There is no such thing as the opposite of 10. Contrast this with qualities which do have contraries, like for example, black and white. And you might ask, what about 10 and negative 10? Right? Are these contraries? I mean, they're clearly the opposite, you might ask. But I tell you that these are not true contraries because they're just different values. Instead of being contraries, quantities are just viewed and compared as bigger, smaller, or equal. Also, important note here, terms like much or little or great or small are just relative and not quantitative. Why? This is because they depend on comparison. They only have meaning relative to another thing. A mountain is small relative to a larger mountain, but great compared to a hill. These terms rely on an external standard, so they cannot have true contraries. And so relatives are not absolute, obviously. You would be in a self-contradiction if you allow contraries to be applied, because if great and small were contraries, a single thing could possess both contrary qualities simultaneously. Because take the example, the same mountain could be both great compared to a hill and small compared to a larger mountain at the same time. This violates, I don't know why I put this violates the most secure principle in all of Aristotle's philosophy, the law of non-contradiction, that something cannot both be and not be at the same time. However, space might be an exception with below and above. Moving on, quantities do not admit of degrees, so one thing can't be more 2 inches long than another object that is also 2 inches long, right? And time is also the same way. A period of time is not more time than another. That wouldn't make sense. Now, quantity is very special, right? Because it contains the predicate equality or inequality as only unique to it, right? So there's no such thing. For example, when I define a word such as, let's say, differentiate, and I say differentiate equals the defining or unique characteristic that separates it from other species. Now, that equal would make that sentence a categorical mistake according to Aristotle's philosophy, because quantity or equality and inequality can only be applied to quantity, okay? And that is why. Now, relatives are things that derive their meaning by reference to something else. For example, superior refers to being superior to something, and double implies being double of something. Habits, dispositions, and perceptions and knowledge and attitudes are all relative terms because their meaning depends on their relation to something else. Knowledge means knowledge of something, right? And some relatives have contraries like virtue. Its contrary is vice, while some don't, like the term double or triple. Relatives also admit degrees. For example, terms like and unlike and equal and unequal because they vary, like for example, more like and less equal. This painting is more like the original than that one. These two things are almost equal but not completely. So those are two examples. And all relatives have correlatives, which means slave implies a master and master implies a slave. Double implies a half and greater implies something less. Now, some might not seem to have one, but that's only because of inaccurate definitions, like a wing is not necessarily relative to a bird, but to a winged creature. This requires accurate definitions. Wing and winged are reciprocal, as a winged creature is defined by its wings, and wings exist only in relation to winged beings. So the rule is, all relatives, when properly defined, have a correlative. And correlatives generally come into existence simultaneously. Some exceptions are knowledge, obviously. Well, I'll explain why. The existence of the double requires the existence of the half, and the existence of a master necessitates the existence of a slave, and vice versa. True necessitates the existence of falsity, and falsity necessitates the existence of true. And so the exceptions, like I've mentioned, would be knowledge, because knowledge is posterior to the existence of the object. So what that means is that knowledge comes after the existence of the object. Thus, then correlatives are dependent on each other. If the double ceases to exist, the half also ceases to exist. If a master no longer exists, then there can be no slave. While some correlatives are asymmetrical. So for example, the annihilation of the object of knowledge eliminates the knowledge itself, but the absence of knowledge does not mean that the object ceases to exist. So, or you can say not A implies not B, but not B doesn't entail not A. This follows to the relation of perception and the perceptible. The perceptible exists before perception. So elements like fire and water, which make up perceiving beings, pre-exist perception. If perceptibles cease to exist, then perception is cancelled. But the non-existence of perception doesn't mean or doesn't eliminate the perceptibles. And moving on, primary substances are not relative because they are defined in reference to anything external. Important rule. If a person knows a relative thing, they must also know the thing it is related to. If a person knows that something is a double, they will also know what it is double of. If someone knows that something is more beautiful, then they must also know what it is more beautiful than. And then moving on to quality. Quality just refers to the characteristics or attributes that allow people or things to be described as having certain qualities or capacities. There are types of qualities that include habit, disposition, and the relationship between habit and disposition. And so a habit is a lasting quality that is firm and established and is very difficult to change or alter. Like knowledge and virtue, like justice or self-control, are considered habits. A disposition is just temporary and easily changeable. And examples of dispositions include states like health or illness, which can shift quickly. A disposition can become a habit if it persists long enough to become difficult to change. And Aristotle posits inborn capacities. This is a type of quality that describes innate qualities or abilities that define a person's capacity to perform certain actions. A person is a good boxer or a good runner due to an inborn capacity to excel in those areas, not because of a temporary disposition. And so, affective qualities and affections are qualities that have the power to affect the senses in specific ways. For examples, for example, sweetness and heat and cold, these qualities affect the sense of touch and are described as affective qualities because they can evoke a response or affection in some body senses. And please note the term affective quality does not imply that the substance itself is affected in some specific way. For instance, honey is sweet not because it is affected by sweetness, but because it contains sweetness as a quality intrinsically. Some exceptions would be whiteness, blackness, and other colors are not considered affective qualities in the same sense as sweetness or heat because these colors themselves result from certain affections. When a person is ashamed, their cheeks may turn red, which is blushing, and when they are afraid, they may become pale. This change in color is due to temporary emotional affections. And if the change in color, like pallor or a darkened complexion, becomes permanent due to factors we say like disease or sunburn, then we would consider it a quality. And in these cases, the person's complexion may remain throughout life, and this is seen as a trait now, rather than just a temporary affection. And temporary color changes like blushing from shame or turning pale from fear, they're not considered permanent qualities. Instead, they're just seen as temporary affections. And Aristotle also talks about traits like insanity or irascibility that are, considered qualities because they are inherent in a person. They persist and define a person in a permanent way. If an abnormal state arises due to the combination of certain factors, and if this state is difficult to remove or becomes permanent, we would classify it as a quality. For example, a person might develop an irritable temperament due to life circumstances, and we would consider this a permanent quality. Conditions that are temporary or easily corrected, like becoming irritable when vexed, are called affections, not qualities, okay? A person who briefly loses their temper is said to be affected by the situation, but they are not characterized as having an inherently irritable nature. Another thing is that a thing's shape, like triangular or quadrangular, straight or curved, can define its essence and is thus considered a quality. The figure or shape of an object is a quality that gives the object its distinct character. For example, a thing is called triangular because of its shape, or straight because of its geometrical properties. Now, terms like rarity, density, and roughness and smoothness actually are not qualities, or they don't belong to the category of quality. Though terms like rarity, density, roughness, and smoothness, they might seem to describe qualities in a colloquial sense, they are not true qualities in the Aristotelian sense. These terms describe the relative positions of the parts within a thing. Let me elaborate. Density, in this case, is a thing is dense because its parts are closely packed together. And rarity, a thing is rare because its parts have spaces between them. And smoothness and roughness, a thing is smooth if its parts are distributed evenly, and rough if some parts will protrude more than others. Most qualities give rise to adjectives that describe the things possessing those qualities. For instance, whiteness leads to the adjective white, and justice leads to just. These adjectives describe things in terms of their qualities. There are cases where a quality does not have a name, and thus the name for the thing possessing that quality is not derived from the quality itself. For instance, a person called a good boxer does not have a name derived from a quality, but from an inborn capacity for boxing. Similarly, a wrestler is named for the practice of wrestling, not for a particular quality. Note that qualities can also have contraries, as I've noted, like black and white. And further, qualities do admit degrees. A thing that is white can be whiter than another thing. Qualities like whiteness, justice, and others are often predicated of things to varying degrees. Qualities have a variable nature, which just means something can be more white potentially or more X potentially. Though, for exceptions, we would count geometrical qualities such as triangular or quadrangular as not admitting a variation in degree. This is because, for instance, they are obviously their essence, or they're defined by their shape, and their shape is considered a quality. This is because, for instance, something is either a triangle or it is not. And if the definition of a particular shape, such as a triangle, applies to an object, the object must be fully triangular. It cannot be more triangular than another triangular thing, okay? It wouldn't make sense to say that. And geometric shapes like a circle or triangle are defined strictly. Therefore, comparing a square to a circle is meaningless, since the definition of a circle is not related or applicable to a square. A very special feature of quality is that it allows for the possibility for us to compare things in terms of likeness and unlikeness. And additional, particular branches of knowledge are not relative. For example, grammar is the knowledge of grammar and not the grammar of something else. Similarly, music is the knowledge of music and not the music of something else. And just remember, action and affection both have contraries and do both admit degrees, with some exceptions being like geometrical shapes, which shapes do, or shapes are a thing's quality as well as it defines its essence. And that is the end of part 2. I will see you in part 3.